In the treatise and the inquiry, Hume introduces the famous problem of the missing shade of blue, which is still discussed today in philosophy of mind. Reflection on the problem itself, as well as some attempts to reconcile what appears to be a glaring contradiction in Hume's own treatment of it, tells us something interesting about how philosophy is done. Speaking of the broader Humean project, Hume proposed nothing less than an overhaul of the way we do philosophy, largely in reaction to what he perceived as the useless and obscure musings of the schoolmen who preceded him and who were still influential at the onset of the 18th century. A cardinal point of Hume's novel approach to philosophy was going to be to conduct an inquiry into how human beings understand things, because only by appreciating human epistemic limits can we produce sound philosophical reasoning. Hume explicitly and very clearly sets out his program for his readers in section 1 of the inquiry, appropriately entitled Of the Different Species of Philosophy, when it is section 2 of the Origin of Ideas that concerns us here. It begins with introduction of Hume's famous distinction between ideas and impressions. Ideas are thoughts, while impressions are sensations. The first are derived from memory and abstract thinking, the second from the senses. Ideas, Hume argues, are weaker copies of impressions, and impressions are obtained directly from experience. For instance, we can feel love for someone, which is an impression, and we can think about the concept of love, which is an idea. Clearly, says Hume, the feeling is much stronger than the concept, as expected if it were derivative. Ultimately, according to Hume, all knowledge comes from experience, which is why he is classified among the British empiricists like Locke, as opposed to the continental rationalists like Spinoza and Leibniz. Hume acknowledges that it would seem that human imagination is boundless, as we can think about all sorts of things that do not usually exist and cannot therefore be experienced, such as unicorns. But he then argues that no matter how apparently fanciful our imagination is, all our complex ideas are in fact combinations of simpler ones, and those in turn can be traced to our experience. Hume gives two arguments in support of his thesis. First, whenever we analyze a complex idea, we find that it is traceable to a combination of simpler ones, of which we ultimately have direct experience. Second, we know that when people have a defect in their sensorial perception, they are incapable of forming the corresponding ideas. For example, a blind man has no concept of color because he has never had an impression of what a color feels like through his senses. We cannot form to ourselves a just idea of the taste of a pineapple without having actually tasted it. So he concludes that our impressions are the causes of our ideas, not our ideas of our impressions. He then says that in some cases, ideas can also cause impressions by giving the missing shade of blue example. He proposed that if a person were presented with a sequence of varying shades of blue but was shown a gap where a particular shade was missing, they would still be able to imagine or conceive of that missing shade, even though they hadn't directly experienced it. Therefore, the mind's ability to fill in this gap challenges the notion that all ideas come directly from impressions. The significance of this example lies in its critique of the empiricist view that all ideas come from direct experiences. Hume used the missing shade of blue to suggest that our ability to conceive of something beyond our direct experiences, even if it's within a familiar context, demonstrates the limitations of relying solely on empirical evidence to account for all of our ideas. Nonetheless, Hume thinks it too rare an instance to cause us to change our generalization. Okay, so what's the big deal here? Well, it doesn't take a sophisticated Hume scholar to figure out that he goes through the following strange sequence. Firstly, he comes up with what he says is a general principle concerning human understanding. Second, he finds an exception to that principle. And thirdly, he then discards that finding as not worthy of consideration. And this, despite the fact that Hume had told his readers a bit earlier that the new philosophy he is proposing is subject to empirical disconfirmation, just like the natural philosophy, also known as science, by which it is inspired. Plenty of commentators have tried to figure it out, attempting to rescue Hume from an embarrassing self-contradiction. And after all, this is arguably the most influential philosopher ever to write in the English language. We will now look at three of several possible solutions to Hume's blue dilemma, as summarized in a paper by John Nelson. The first suggestion advanced by Nelson is that Hume deliberately weakened his empiricist position, giving an opening to the rival rationalist approach through a sort of self created Trojan horse. Admitting that the missing shade of blue could be conceived a priori without recourse to experience would, in fact, do just that. Now, why would Hume shoot himself in his philosophical foot? Because Hume's philosophy also includes an important role for instincts, which in fact he discusses right after the section we are concerned with here. And instincts are innate, that is, they precede direct sense experience. Nelson, however, immediately discards this possibility for the explanation of the missing shades problem. If that were really Hume's intent, then he would have constructed his subsequent arguments in the inquiry in a much more rationalist friendly fashion, which he most certainly did not do. Option 2 then. This one comes from R. Cummins. Essentially, the suggestion is that one can reasonably interpret Hume's having an idea of X, say the missing shade of blue, as meaning having a capacity to recognize X, in which case the apparent contradiction would instantly disappear. Since Hume would not be providing an example that potentially undermines his main thesis, he would simply entertain the possibility that people are capable of recognizing that there is a missing shade of blue among a range of colors offered to them. The problem with this solution, as Nelson quickly points out, is that Hume himself is very clear that he considers the missing shade to be a contradictory phenomenon, which is entirely inconsistent with Cummins' way out of the dilemma. Nelson here, thirdly, has his own theory. He suggests that Hume's bringing up of a possible contradiction to his main thesis about how people form ideas is in perfect harmony with his even more general thesis that human understanding of matters of facts is only probable, never certain. Hume, according to Nelson, is providing a possible example of how his own theories about a particular matter of fact, the ultimate origin of human ideas, could be mistaken, which proves his meta point about there being no such thing as certainty about anything empirical. Hume simply found a hypothetical example that doesn't go well with his general account, but he thinks that the alleged exception is so contrived as to fail to make a general point, and he therefore proceeds to ignore it.